Hello everyone, it's Simon Smart from CPX Podcast. October the 4th to the 10th is Mental Health Week in Australia. There are a bunch of events planned around this, largely to raise awareness of the issue of mental health. And to talk about this, I'm joined today by Dr. Amelia Haines. Amelia, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Simon. It's a pleasure.
Now, Amelia, you've worked as a doctor in this area of mental health. There seems to be less stigma these days attached to mental health issues than there once was. Do you think I'm right in that assessment?
Actually, really optimistically, I actually think you are right. I actually do think, even though it's probably very minimal, society in general, people's views in general are actually slightly more accepting and open and interested and not so freaked out, basically, by mental health.
Yes. Do you think that's because it's just been brought onto the agenda by some high-profile cases of people saying, look, I've got a problem here? And
yeah, I think it's helped. I think it has. It's helped. And it hasn't just been Hollywood stars. I mean, we certainly get that, and it's not just Norma Jean and her possible suicide and Owen Wilson and his suicide attempt. We have actually got some more kind of serious figures putting their hands up as actually having suffered from depression. So I think actually the fact that quite a few politicians in Australia have come clean and been publicly open and helpful about their struggles with mental illness and what it's meant for them and their families has been fantastic, actually. So good on them.
Yeah, it's a brave thing, isn't it? And it helps to sort of take away some of the negative press around it or negative feeling that people sometimes have about it. It's a very serious issue, though, isn't it? And it appears to me, I could be wrong on this, but it appears to me as if mental health problems are on the increase. Seems to be lots more and more people starting to suffer from issues like depression and anxiety. Do you think that's an accurate impression?
And there's lots of research that would actually be indicating those kind of things, actually. People are more isolated. People are abusing sort of mood-altering substances more. People are in fractured kind of social groups. And we know that all those things like feeling a sense of belonging, being well actually even physically, exercising. We know we're all exercising less. We all know that from, recent news about increasing childhood obesity. So, I think maybe the things that keep us well are on the decrease. So maybe that part of mental health is actually on the increase.
When people are mentally unwell, can they get better?
Well, they can, which is encouraging news. And I think that is encouraging news for people when they are even first diagnosed with something like depression. You can actually say to them, you are not going to become some other person that is this diseased and weird person for the rest of your life. You can be treated, and, in a few months you can be you again. And that's very encouraging to friends and family as well.
Yeah, have you seen good examples of this where people have perhaps even had major incidents of illness, perhaps even psychotic type of illnesses, and they can get better? I wonder whether some people think, that's a life sentence.
Psychiatrically, people kind of break into two groups largely. They kind of cross. Mental illness is still kind of poorly understood. So you've got psychosis. So those are the people who are schizophrenic. They're hearing things. They're seeing things. We all look at those kind of issues and go, wow, that's real madness. And then there are the other things like depression and kind of mood disorders, anxiety, and we tend to think of those as neurotic. We all feel really bad about the term neurotic because it makes us feel like we're losers anyway if we get lumbered with that title. But that's just the way things are broken down and understood at this point in time.
That's more common, isn't it? The anxiety, depression.
It is. Once again, we come in all sort of forms and variations, and some of us, we are more prone to becoming anxious and depressed, and some people are just luckier and they're just more kind of armour-plated. But it tends to be a bit of a genetic thing, actually, that it doesn't mean you're a stronger person. I think that's a bit of a myth around mental illness. People tend to think, oh gosh, you got depressed, that must mean you're weak. And it doesn't mean that at all. It can just mean you really do have a strong genetic predisposition to it. And it doesn't mean you're weak at all. In fact, you can be fabulously functional. And certainly, people do get better. But back to the psychosis too, even with something as scary as psychosis, for goodness sake, actually being mentally unwell enough to actually be hearing people talking to you that aren't there, that sounds really frightening. It is frightening for the people who are experiencing it. But even in those cases, people can experience an episode like that and actually never experience another one in their lives. So I think that's a really important point of hope for people who are diagnosed with these things, and once again, their friends and family, because it is too scary to think, oh my goodness, maybe this will be my life forever, and it's just a downhill spiral.
I was interested in that comment you made about people being mentally strong. Mm-hmm. I think a part of what we see is this idea that people can just snap out of mental illness if they try hard enough. That's a pretty unhelpful way to think of this, isn't it? I
think it is incredibly unhelpful. However, it's interesting how much we all fall into thinking that even when we ourselves are going through some sort of mental illness, or when we have a friend or someone we love who is, how quickly you can fall into thinking, oh, just pull yourself together, because that's what you do when everything's functioning well. You do pull it all together. You have a random, awful, sad thought, and you kind of go, well, that's just silly because actually everything else is excellent. But when you're in the midst of a mental illness, it really is like being in the midst of having pneumonia. You really do have a disease, and you can't just snap yourself out of pneumonia. You can't just snap yourself out of depression. It really is a process, and different things have been shown to help. So I was going to say, it would appear now statistically that the best thing is a combination of sort of talking therapy, which, psychotherapy, call it whatever you want to. Talking therapy is helpful, though some people, of course, want to run away screaming from that. But I was going to say, talking therapy is good, with usually a combination with an antidepressant is the best way to come out of a depression. And no one's actually managed to ever just snap themselves out of it that we know of.
It's certainly not the case that people with religious belief are protected from problems of mental illness, is it? You've seen that plenty of times.
Yeah.
Yet there is some research that would suggest once people have mental illness, they may in fact do better in terms of coping with it and recovering from it if they're attached to a religious community and if they're involved in religious undertaking and practice.
It is true. Actually, within the mental health system of Australia, people, if they do have any sort of religious affiliation, spiritual interest, they are actually usually encouraged to explore that and go back to it if they've kind of wandered away from it, because it can be incredibly helpful to their recovery. Being part of communities like you'll find within church denominations are incredibly helpful and protective. So certainly when you're suffering depression or anxiety or a psychotic breakdown for whatever reason, church communities can be incredibly helpful in your recovery. But also, for those of us who are lucky not to have had anything like that, being part of a supportive group of people who have similar interests and so on is good. I was going to say that almost makes it sound like a social club, but I actually do think it's deeper than that for people.
Is it peculiar? I was going to say that. Could it be just could you get the same thing? And you probably at least to a degree.
I was going to say, to be perfectly honest, I think we have to be honest here and say, it's true. Like a social club or a dancing troupe or whatever could also be very helpful. So it's not just the spiritual aspect, but I think there is more in the spiritual aspect as well.
What is peculiar to say, for instance, to a Christian community that might be most helpful in this area?
When we look at Jesus, we can see that he loved the unlovely. He loved the kind of people that sometimes make us feel a bit anxious, or they're a little bit not like the people we really want to see ourselves as being or hang around with. So Christians, are called to be more accepting of people who aren't totally fitting into what everyone considers as mainstream society for a time. So there's that. I'm sure a lot of people think, gosh, do you think church is really a good place for someone who's psychotic and they're going to hear people talking about these things like miracles and what have you, and it's just going to play into their psychosis? So, there are people who will say, are you sure actually that a church is a good place for them? But interestingly enough, they tend to be helpful in people's recovery and certainly in keeping people well and happy and connected and useful in society.
I'm speaking with Dr. Amelia Haines. Amelia, if people are depressed, or perhaps if people around them are not doing so well mentally, what advice do you give them?
To be perfectly honest, we should all be doing this. So it's not just people who are teetering on the brink of a depression or in a depression, but certainly it has been shown that these things do actually help people who are in the midst of a depression. Exercise. I mean, we're hearing it from everywhere, but I mean, here's another place for us to realise that actually it is important. The mind-body connection does exist, and certainly it's almost like if you care for yourself enough to take yourself out to exercise, your brain gets that message and certain neural pathways are sparked and positive neurotransmitters are we know the endorphins are produced, but other positive ones are produced as well. It's almost like you let your mind know that you're worth caring about. So exercise is very important that way. And often you'll talk to people who've suffered with depression all their lives, like very chronically, especially if they do have a genetic reason to. And the ones who have bitten the bullet and walk every day often do better than people who don't do such a thing. So
I can defend my surfing in the mornings more
you
easily with that advice. Thank you.
I actually think you can definitely convince your wife that is keeping you sane. The other thing is, often when we are not doing terribly well mentally, with any kind of mental illness actually, we don't care for ourselves. We'll often notice that people, their hair's getting really, yucky and their clothes are scruffy and so on and so forth. So actually self-care is another way that we can actually keep ourselves mentally healthier. It seems, this is actually a good argument for people we know who actually like clothes and like to...
Retail therapy?
Yeah. So I'm not saying that so much, but sort of along those lines, that actually, once again, showing your mind that you care for yourself by actually bothering to be clean and have a haircut and doing all of those things that actually really are quite pleasurable, that is actually very helpful and shouldn't be poo-pooed. So self-care I also talk about. Sleep is very important and is often something that you hear people complain about when they're not doing so well mentally. So sleep hygiene, it's actually called now. It's actually got an official little title. So we actually know from very long-term studies that the adult human needs 7 to 9 hours sleep a night. In fact, more than 9 is actually not helpful. That's good for some people to know. And under 7 isn't helpful. So all of those... world leaders who get less than 7, it all sounds terribly glamorous, but it's not actually such a good idea.
I was going to say that alone might explain some of the problems that we're seeing, because I think sleep is less and less a priority for people. Exercise,
sleep, self-care, and having fun is actually really important too. So, certainly we know this from doing sort of useful diversional activities. So, actually remembering that you do like painting, and so to allow yourself to paint, or you do like playing guitar, so you do allow yourself to do that. So that's all important. But even going out and having a good laugh, or just being around other people who are, enjoying one another, even if you can't take part in it when you're feeling really rotten, even those very activities also help. So those are the 4 that I always encourage people to do.
They seem great preventatives to me, like great things for all of us to do.
Yes, they are.
Imagine, though, that we've got someone who is clearly not doing well, they're feeling depressed. What should they do? Do they go to the doctor? What's the next step?
It's up to you, I think, to find the right people to see. So if you find your GP okay, but you don't love them or feel very warmly towards them, perhaps they are not going to be the person for you to see every week, but perhaps they're going to be the person who will medicate you and medicate you extremely sensibly. But maybe you would actually like to go and talk to someone else. And I think people often feel very weak about going and seeing someone to talk, but really it's just accessing a service, just like anything else really, just like buying fruit and vegetables. You're actually you're accessing it. It's someone who cares but isn't part of your family, which is actually really quite nice. They've got nothing else to do but actually be there for you. So it feels very odd at first, but I do recommend that. I think, everyone needs it. I think surrounding yourself with people who you feel are safe and trusted is good. And yeah, I think part of it is acknowledging the problem, like actually going, even though this pains me to acknowledge it or to admit it, I really do think that I can allow myself to be diagnosed with a depression here.
Dr. Amelia Haines, thanks so much for sharing that with us.
My pleasure, Simon.